Most men, when they nearly die, come back softer. Niki Lauda came back with a different way of seeing. August 1st, 1976, lap 2 of the German Grand Prix. Niki Lauda's Ferrari enters the Bergwerk section of the Nurburgring, 14 miles of road carved through forest, mountain, and shadow. A track so long and so brutal that marshals couldn't see half of it. His car clips a barrier. It doesn't spin. It doesn't slide gently into a wall. It explodes. Lauda is trapped inside a burning car for nearly a minute. He inhales flame. His lungs blister. His face is destroyed. By the time the other drivers pull him free, the doctors give him last rites. He is not expected to live through the night. He lived. And what came out of that hospital room 42 days later was not a broken man. It was not even a cautious man. What came out was something far more dangerous to his competition. A man who had permanently lost the illusion of invincibility. A man who now watched everything in a Formula One paddock with the eyes of someone who knew, not theoretically but physically, what this sport could do to a human body. Niki Lauda never published a formal list of dangerous drivers. He never sat down with a journalist and ranked the men he feared. That wasn't how he communicated. But across decades of interviews, 2 autobiographies, and the testimony of engineers, teammates, and rivals who knew him across 4 decades, a picture emerges, a remarkably consistent picture of which drivers genuinely concerned him on a racetrack, and more importantly, why. The reasoning is what makes this story worth telling, because his reasoning was unlike anyone else's. Lauda returned to racing at the 1976 Italian Grand Prix at Monza. His wounds were still healing. His helmet had been modified to fit over his reconstructed skull. Entire grandstands gave him a standing ovation before the race even started. The crowd saw courage. The media called it the greatest act of bravery in sports history. Lauda characteristically disagreed. In interviews across his lifetime, he was consistent on this point. He came back not because he was brave, but because he was unfinished. He had a championship to defend. He had a point to prove, not to the sport, but to himself, that he could assess risk clearly, without emotion, without the romantic mythology that Formula One loved to drape over everything. That was who Niki Lauda was before the crash and after it. He described himself in his own words as not a natural. He did not feel the car the way some drivers felt it, through instinct, through some invisible conversation between man and machine. He calculated it. He studied it. He built lap times the way an engineer builds a bridge. With data, with structure, with an absolute intolerance for variables he hadn't accounted for. He said more than once that the perfect lap was the one that looked boring from the outside. No drama, no heroics. Just a man and a car operating at the outer edge of what physics allowed, cleanly, without waste, without theater. That philosophy, that obsession with the elimination of unnecessary risk, is what made Lauda's assessment of other drivers so uniquely valuable, because he wasn't watching them the way a fan watches. He wasn't watching them the way a rival watches, looking for weakness to exploit. He was watching them as a systems analyst watches a machine running close to its failure point. He was reading what you might call risk distribution, who absorbs danger cleanly and who exports it onto the 9 other drivers sharing the track with them. That distinction between drivers who own their risk and drivers who leak it outward became the lens through which Lauda evaluated everything he saw. And what he saw in certain drivers across his career was something the public rarely recognized, because the public measured danger in crashes and headlines and visible recklessness. Lauda measured it in gaps, between intention and action, between perception and reality, between belief and physics. Let's start with the name everyone expects, James Hunt. Lauda's great rival, the Englishman who dressed like a rock star, drove like a man who'd made peace with death, and charmed absolutely everyone who ever met him. The 1976 season, the season of the Nurburgring crash, was defined by their rivalry. 2 men more different in temperament and philosophy would be hard to imagine. Hunt lived loudly. Lauda lived precisely. And yet, when Lauda spoke about Hunt in the 1996 Rush documentary interviews, in his memoir To Hell and Back, in conversations recorded by journalists who covered them both, the assessment was almost always the same. He respected Hunt, not as a lifestyle, not as a personality, But as a racing driver, the reason is counterintuitive, and it tells you everything about how Lauda thought. Hunt's driving style was committed to a degree that alarmed most of the paddock. He would go deep into corners that no one else would attempt. Fully committed, no margin for error. But that commitment, Lauda noted, was readable. When Hunt was going to do something extreme, you could see the setup. The intention was visible. If you were the driver beside him, you could account for it. Lauda described Hunt's aggression, and this is documented across multiple interviews, as honest. The car did what Hunt intended. There was no gap between intention and action. What Lauda valued more than almost anything else on a racetrack was that kind of physical honesty. A driver who was wild but legible was, in Lauda's framework, manageable. You could build a safety margin around a man whose extremes you could anticipate. The drivers who kept Lauda awake were not the openly aggressive ones. They were the absent ones. His own Ferrari teammate, Clay Regazzoni, occupied a complicated position in Lauda's thinking. And Lauda addressed this with characteristic directness, in interviews and in print. Begin with what Regazzoni did at the Nurburgring. When Lauda's car was burning, Regazzoni was the first driver to stop. He pulled over in the middle of a live race, ran back through oncoming traffic, and tried with his bare hands to pull Lauda from the wreck. Arturo Merzario and 2 other drivers ultimately freed him. For that act alone, Lauda expressed deep personal respect, publicly and repeatedly. He said so in his memoirs. He said so in interviews. That was never in question. But Regazzoni, the racing driver, was a separate question entirely. Lauda wrote and spoke about a specific type of driver that he found genuinely difficult to race alongside. Not the aggressive driver, not the reckless driver, but what he described as the driver who was physically in the car, but mentally somewhere else. Present in body, delayed in processing. Lauda was circumspect about naming Regazzoni directly in these discussions, but his memoirs make the underlying concern clear enough. Regazzoni was extraordinarily talented on his best days. Lauda acknowledged this without qualification, but his consistency was unpredictable in a way that no amount of studying his data could resolve, because the variable wasn't in the car. It was in the man's attention. And absent attention, at the speeds Formula One operates at, is not a minor concern. A half-second lag in awareness at Monza means roughly 80 feet of track. 80 feet where a driver is physically present but operationally gone, with no signal to the drivers around him. You cannot build a safety margin around a variable you cannot read. This brings us to the driver who forces the most difficult conversation in this story, because the next name is not someone the public associated with danger in any conventional sense. He was, by near universal agreement among his contemporaries, the most purely gifted driver of his generation. Ronnie Peterson, the Swede they called Super Swede. His car control was in a category that other elite drivers struggled to describe. The rear end stepping out, the car rotating on a knife edge, and Peterson threading it through, making corrections that happened faster than conscious thought could track. He made the impossible look unhurried. Jackie Stewart called him the most naturally talented driver he had ever seen. Mario Andretti, his Lotus teammate in 1978, described racing alongside Peterson as the closest thing to watching a different species operate a car. And the concern Lauda had about Peterson was not about his skill. It was about the specific nature of that skill. When a driver's reflexes operate significantly faster than his situational awareness, when the body is responding to the car before the mind has fully processed the environment around it, something occasionally falls through the gap. In isolation, in time trials, in clean air with one car on a track, it produces results that look supernatural. In the compression of a race start, in a pack of 20 cars, in the chaos that happens in the first 200 meters when everyone reaches the first corner simultaneously, that gap between reflex and awareness can become a problem that no amount of talent can solve. Monza, 1978. The lights go out. The field accelerates toward the first chicane. A contact, cars airborne, barriers, fire. Ronnie Peterson trapped in his Lotus on the side of the track. He was carried away alive. He did not survive the night. Complications from his injuries, his legs badly broken, an embolism took him by morning. He was 34 years old. Lauda was at that race. He saw what happened, and what he said about Peterson in the years afterward, rarely and always with care, carried the particular weight of a man who had watched something accumulate that he had no power to stop. Then there was Gilles Villeneuve. Lauda's assessment of Villeneuve is one of the clearest things he ever put on record about another driver. He called him, in multiple interviews, the fastest driver he had ever seen. He also said, and he was precise about this, that he found Villeneuve frightening to race against. Not dirty, not cheap, not cynical. Frightening. The word choice matters, and Lauda was not careless with words. The distinction he was drawing was between a driver who pushes against limits he recognizes and a driver who genuinely does not register limits as limits. Villeneuve belonged to the second category, and everyone who raced him or worked with him confirmed it. He believed, not as a tactic, not as psychological warfare, but as a sincere operating premise, that the corner could always be taken faster, that the breaking point could always be moved later, that full commitment would always find a way. His engineers at Ferrari have described this extensively in interviews and in the various books written about him in the decades since. Jody Scheckter, his teammate, said Villeneuve was the only driver he ever saw who truly didn't understand the concept of an acceptable limit. Not because he was unintelligent. Villeneuve was extremely intelligent, but because his relationship with physical limits was architecturally different from other drivers. The most famous illustration of this is Zandvoort in 1979, when Villeneuve drove back to the pits at racing speed on 3 wheels. The fourth gone, the broken suspension stub dragging sparks along the track. He damaged the car considerably further in doing so. When asked why, the answer that emerged from his debrief was essentially, he wanted to show his engineers exactly what had failed. He needed to understand it. The idea of simply stopping at the side of the track did not present itself to him as a meaningful option. Lauda saw in Villeneuve something he recognized, not from his own driving, but from the Nurburgring itself. The collision point between absolute conviction and a world that does not negotiate. He could see the talent with complete clarity, he said so, and he could see, with equal clarity, the trajectory. Zolder, 1982. Qualifying. Gilles Villeneuve died in the car, and then there is the final name, the one that requires the most careful framing, because the story here is not about recklessness or absence or limitlessness. The story here is about the precise opposite of everything that had concerned Lauda before. In 1984, Lauda was the reigning world champion at McLaren. The team signed a young Brazilian for that season. Same car, same data, same engineering support. Ayrton Senna. What Lauda observed in those months, watching Senna from the closest professional vantage point in the sport, he discussed across a number of interviews in subsequent years. The assessments were consistent. He said Senna was the most complete driver he had ever seen. He said the combination of raw pace, technical intelligence, mental endurance, and competitive intensity was unlike anything else he had encountered across his entire career. He also said something that sits in a very specific place in the historical record. He said Senna operated from a set of convictions about himself and about racing that placed him in a category entirely his own. Senna spoke openly about this himself, not reluctantly, not in private, but in interviews, in press conferences, in conversations that were recorded and are part of the public record. He described being guided through certain laps by something beyond conscious control. His account of his qualifying lap at Monaco in 1984, the lap in which he was 16 seconds faster than the second-place driver before the session was stopped, describes a state of such complete immersion that he felt he was no longer making decisions in any ordinary sense. He spoke about God, about destiny, about corners arriving and the car finding its way through them by something that transcended his own agency. These were not metaphors. He was not being poetic for the cameras. People who knew Senna well, his biographers, his engineers, Frank Williams, Ron Dennis, have consistently confirmed that his spiritual convictions were sincere, total, and completely integrated into how he understood his own driving. Lauda heard this and understood it in a way that was shaped entirely by what he had experienced at the Nurburgring, because Lauda had spent 8 years reconstructing himself around a single principle, that the track is indifferent, that it does not respond to talent or will or conviction, that the moment a driver believes the laws of physics have arranged an exception for him specifically, that is the moment the variables he stopped accounting for begin to accumulate. Every other driver Lauda had concerns about operated with some version of this miscalibration. Regazzoni's attention wandered. Peterson's reflexes outpaced his awareness. Villeneuve's commitment exceeded his acknowledgement of limits. These were all, in different ways, failures to fully account for what was there. Senna was a different kind of question entirely. Senna had not undercounted the risk. He had, by his own testimony, placed it in a category that physics could not reach. He had constructed a framework in which his protection was not a function of technique or calculation or margin, but of something prior to all of those things, something given, something outside the reach of barriers and walls and the mechanical world in which a racing car operates. Lauda's response to this, documented across interviews, was not contempt. It was not dismissal. It was a specific, quiet concern. He admired Senna openly and repeatedly. He said so. He also said, and the interviews exist, that he did not understand how Senna thought about risk, and that the inability to model it was itself the issue. Because the one mechanism Lauda credited above all others for keeping a racing driver alive was not reflexes or fitness or the quality of the car. It was the small, persistent, functional voice that says, "The wall is real. The corner is real. The laws of physics apply to this car and this driver in this moment." That voice is not timidity. That voice is the operational floor beneath which no talent, however extraordinary, can protect you. And in Senna, that voice appeared to have been replaced by something else entirely. Imola, May 1st, 1994. Lauda lived until 2019. He was 70 years old. In his later years as non-executive chairman at Mercedes, he came to every race. He walked every paddock. He stood at the pit wall and watched the cars with an expression that the people who were with him struggled to name. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't sentiment. It was the expression of a man who was still doing what he had always done. Reading the field, looking at the gaps, watching for the men who didn't know what they didn't know, watching for absence, watching for conviction without margin, watching for the ones who had stopped hearing the voice that tells you, the wall is real, the corner is real, the laws of physics filed no exception for you. Formula One has always had a complicated relationship with the truth that Lauda embodied. The sport is built on the drivers who seem to exist outside ordinary vulnerability, who appear to be exempt from the terms that govern other human beings at speed, who make the impossible look not just achievable, but inevitable. The sport needs those drivers. The crowd comes to see them. The cameras follow them. The mythology is built around them. But Lauda knew what that apparent exemption costs. He had worn the evidence of it on his face for 43 years. He knew, with a precision that no other driver of his era shared, that the most dangerous man on a racetrack is not the one who takes risks beyond what others will attempt. It is the one who has stopped registering that risks exist. Not because the risks have diminished, but because the driver's ability to perceive them has been replaced by something else, by instinct, by absence, by limitlessness, by absolute faith. Formula One has had faster drivers than Niki Lauda, more naturally gifted ones, more beloved ones, drivers who went places on a racetrack that made Lauda himself acknowledge limitations he would not cross. But it has never had another driver who was consumed alive in his car and came back, not haunted, not diminished, not performing a recovery for the cameras, but genuinely, functionally clear. Clear about what the sport was, clear about what it demanded, clear about what it took from the men who forgot or never learned or simply stopped asking whether the next corner was real. That clarity was Lauda's real career. The 3 championships were simply the proof that it worked. Niki Lauda, 1949 to 2019. The only man who came back from the fire and never stopped seeing what it showed him.